This episode of Mossback is presented by the Crosscut Ideas Festival, April 29th to May 6th, online and in Seattle.
I think that there's definitely a sense that our major virtue is our location, as opposed to the man-made environment, human-made environment that we created here. As nice as that might be, it's not our top selling point.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from KCTS9 and Crosscut. And in case you wondered, Mossback's Northwest is a fascinating look at the history of the most interesting place on Earth. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knute Berger.
And today we're going to talk about when Hollywood has come to Seattle. If you haven't already seen this segment, which is called Lights, Camera, Seattle, I'm going to suggest you stop right now. Just go to the show notes or the show page on crosscut.com and take a few moments and check it out. And we'll see you back here when you do.
In 1962, the British journalist Alistair Cooke came to Seattle to check out the World's Fair. Cooke captured the Seattle paradox of those times, an unglamorous city whose main feature was its setting. This duality is one that Hollywood exploited, a gritty city in a pretty place.
If you've ever come across a film being shot in Seattle, the first thing I think you'll notice is how big of a deal it is. Lots of trucks, lots of crew, lots of traffic disruption. It's big business. And Hollywood has come to Seattle. And Knute, you have been doing a little bit of research on this, on films shot in Seattle. Why go down this particular path?
Well, it's a great local experience. If you live in the city and a Hollywood movie is made there, it's so much fun just to kind of say, hey, I know where that is, or I know where they shot that, or that, often Hollywood films scramble cities so that you see a chase scene and somebody will be in one part of town and suddenly they're in another. It's just kind of a fun way to see how you're seen through Hollywood's eyes. And of course, there are many eyes, as you point out. Not only are there big film crews, but many directors, many actors, many script writers. And so Dave Quantick, who's the editor of Mossback's Northwest, had said, I think it'd be really fun to do an episode on movies made in Seattle. And so then we began the process of thinking about, well, what movies have been made here, and set here. What did these films say about Seattle? What have they said? And as we began to look at those over time, a couple of kind of trends or themes emerged. And so it's just a way to see ourselves through that Hollywood lens and see how they saw us.
Right. It's a way to imagine how other people see us and how people have arrived at Seattle stereotypes. And I imagine there's several movies that have, I know there are several movies who have perpetuated particular stereotypes about Seattle.
Yes.
That we chuckle at, right?
Yes, indeed.
So let's start at the beginning.
Well, I mean, the first big Hollywood movie that was shot in Seattle was back in the 30s, and that was Tugboat Annie. Although it didn't take place in Seattle per se, it took place in Tacoma, which was this, blend of Seattle and Tacoma. And but you really don't see Hollywood here until the 1960s in terms of major films. And so our view kind of looks at the period from the 1960s through the 1990s. Anything more recent isn't quite history, I guess. And we wanted to sort of, look at what we thought were kind of key landmark films as far as how Seattle was used. Used is probably the right word.
I'm curious why the makers of Tugboat Annie chose a fictitious name, Tacoma? Why couldn't they just say Seattle?
Well, I think partly because the elements of the maritime tradition in Seattle and Tacoma were sort of blended, because the character Tugboat Annie was based on was actually the woman who founded Foss Tugs in Tacoma. So I think there was just in the writer's head and whatnot, there was this connection where just, one town. He made a fictitious town in the stories of Tugboat Annie, and they just carried that into the movie. But it was mostly, shot here in Seattle in terms of the location stuff. So the Thea Foss tugboat, which still exists, was used in the film. Down at Bell Street Pier, there was a huge crowd scene with thousands of Seattleites participated in. So, and it really captured that sort of flavor of the maritime city. And you see that crop up in some movies over time. We talked about Cinderella Liberty movie from the early 70s starring James Caan as a sailor on leave in Seattle. And it's really does a great job, although this wasn't their intention exactly, but does a great job of capturing that period of First Avenue as Skid Road with the bars, taverns, the places where sailors on leave and merchant seamen would hang out. It definitely captures that sort of flavor from the 70s.
The grimy part of Seattle.
Yeah, and once you get into the 1960s, there's a very different image being sort of enhanced to begin with, which is the Space Needle. We say in the episode, we talk about the fact that Alistair Cooke, famous for Masterpiece Theater and other things, he was a correspondent for The Guardian and came to cover the World's Fair and went up the Space Needle. And he makes this observation that I thought was really interesting, which was, he said, you have this godlike view looking at the horizon. You see Puget Sound, you see the mountains, and then you look down at the city itself. And, he says, it mocks the godlike view of grandeur, the works of man below, the sprawling freight yards, the waterfront, and miles of junk and secondhand car lots. This is, pre-Amazon, Belltown, and Denny Triangle.
Well, Alistair Cooke was very sophisticated, and maybe Seattle wasn't as sophisticated enough for him.
Well, that's true. And the fair was supposed to change minds. But, being objective about it, Seattle wasn't nobody would have said Seattle was a world-class city in 1962. But the World's Fair was supposed to change that. Elvis Presley came and made a movie which was shot during the fair. It happened at the World's Fair. There's a famous scene of him dining in the Space Needle, which actually was not shot on the Space Needle. They created a rotating set at MGM Studios in Hollywood, and they completely made an exact replica of a wedge of the restaurant and pretended that it was here. But it sort of represented this kind of, mid-century glamour, the fancy rotating restaurant, and this beautiful harbor scenery and the twinkling lights and that kind of thing. And so it had a, very sort of distinct image that wasn't the old Seattle image of Tugboat Annie. It was the new image of Seattle in the 21st century, ultra-modern place.
Modern, futuristic, as was the theme of the fair.
Yes, exactly.
Well, the Space Needle's featured in a lot of different films, either featured or certainly noticed. Any other films where the Space Needle really sticks out?
Yeah, there is. So in 1974, the movie The Parallax View, which is a political suspense film, and the opening scene takes place on the Space Needle. And there is a party, a political gathering on the observation deck of the Space Needle, and a U.S. senator is assassinated. And of course, this is in 1974. You're coming out of the late 60s with the era of assassinations, like Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy. This feeling of political violence. You're navigating the Watergate era where there's suspicion of government and conspiracies and that kind of thing. Well, this film centers in on that. And the senator's assassinated, blood spatters on the windows of the Space Needle, and the world's dumbest assassin, is a waiter, dressed as a waiter, and he runs up the Space Needle to escape onto the roof, and is chased there by the security, and then falls off. It was interesting because when I was researching the book I did on the Space Needle for the 50th anniversary, I took a look at the movie, and I noticed that they had filmed it at the Space Needle. Apparently, they had permission from whoever was managing it. But when the film came out and it was this violent assassination scene, there were people, in the whether it was a Space Needle ownership group or whatever, was kind of appalled by this and complained. And Bagley Wright, who was president of the Space Needle Corporation at that time, said, well, gee, I didn't know about this. I didn't know they were filming this. So quickly kind of backed away from it because somehow this was tarnishing Seattle's image.
No script approval for the Space Needle, folks.
No, and none requested, apparently.
Well, the Space Needle certainly was in Austin Powers. What was it, The Spy Who Shagged Me?
Yeah, the opening scene, Dr. Evil is ensconced in a exclusive Starbucks, representing evil at the top of the Space Needle. He owns the top of the Space Needle, and this is where he and his henchmen are meeting. But that film was in the early 2000s, so we didn't include it. But yes, it's definitely not filmed on location, but we all know where it is.
Well, if you imagine the flip side of whether it's the futuristic, sparkling excitement of modernism and the World Fair, what movies have played on the darker, danker, damper, cloudy, moody Seattle as a set theme?
Well, here's a film that's sort of, I think of it as a little bit of a transitional film because it has some of the hope and promise of a modern city, but then it also has a dark side to it. And it kind of probes a little bit of the darkness of mid-century America. And that's a 1965 film, The Slender Thread, starring Sidney Poitier and Bancroft. And it was based on a Life magazine story by Shana Alexander about Seattle's innovative crisis clinic. And the idea that people with a mental health crisis could call a phone number and somebody in there somebody on the other end would help you and could talk you through it and could get you help. And in this film, Sidney Poitier is a student at the University of Washington, and he's working part-time in the evenings at the crisis clinic, and he ends up being the only guy there in this one particular evening. And the phone rings, and Sidney Poitier answers the phone, and then he's caught in this long drama with Anne Bancroft, who's a fairly well-to-do middle-class white lady who is threatening to commit suicide. In fact, says, "I'm committing suicide, as we speak. I've taken the pills," and so the film is kind of a tick-tock on, are they going to save her? It's a drama filmed in Seattle. It has that element of, Seattle as a suicide city, which you were talking about some of the images of Seattle. That's an old image that we used to have.
It's an old stereotype, isn't it? That the suicide rates in Seattle are so much higher than other places.
Yeah, and the rain and the clouds and that kind of thing, and maybe too much Scandinavian psyche or something. But the film, in many respects, is sort of upbeat about, here's a city that's devoting resources, all the resources of the city in this case to save a single life of somebody going through a kind of mid-century middle class malaise.
We'll be right back after this message.
Are you nerdy by nature? Do you get thirsty for thinkers? The Crosscut Ideas Festival is returning to Seattle April 29th to May 6th with fresh conversations to quench your curiosity. We'll explore issues and innovations in science, health, equity, and politics, like wokeness in America, spiritual prescriptions for mental health, the heavy hand of the Supreme Court, and the rise of AI. Join Michael Barbaro, Audie Cornish, Eric Holder, Deepak Chopra, Ibram X. Kendi, Andrew Yang, and more. Tickets at crosscut.com/festival.
I think I remember probably at least 15 years ago or 20 years ago, Sylvester Stallone action movie was filmed here. I think it was Assassin or Assassins, something like that.
Yeah.
But has Seattle ever
With
been...
Antonio Banderas.
That's right. I think they were jumping off the monorail or something, chasing each other on the top of the monorail. Has Seattle ever been the locale for movies that are action-oriented or crime-oriented?
Yeah. Yes. And it's funny you mentioned that one, because when I told my son that we were doing an episode on movies in Seattle, he said, well, you picked me up one time and took me to see a Sylvester Stallone movie being made on Queen Anne Hill. I had totally forgotten that I used to grab my kids and go see weird stuff. And we didn't see the stars or anything, but that film was being made up there. And the only reason I looked it up was because he remembered it. I blanked it out. So that's a really interesting thing, because I think Seattle for a time became kind of, I describe it as a low-rent San Francisco. I mean, you think about movies like Steve McQueen, you think about Dirty Harry. There were these kind of copycat films where you had to have, an incredible chase scene.
Up and down hills.
Up and down hills. That's the thing. And San Francisco kind of made that famous. Well, if San Francisco's been done, can you find another location? Seattle was sort of perfect for that. So in the early 70s, John Wayne came to town and made McHugh, where he's a private eye, and there are some memorable chase scenes in that movie. Kind of hilarious if you know the actual geography of Seattle, because these chase scenes would start out in one place and end up miles away in another place. There is a film that Dave Quantick turned me on to. What I had never heard of this film, called Scorchy. And it stars Connie Stevens. It's made in the early 70s. She's like a female Austin Powers, except there's no joke or no irony. I mean, she's like this super feminist, super sexual, super violent. I mean,
she's
superhero.
a detective.
She's a detective.
With the motto, mess with Scorchy and you'll get burned.
Exactly. I mean, to me, it's like the Plan 9 from outer space of chase movies. Scorchy chases the bad guys through town.
They're heroin dealers, right? She's
she's
tracking the connection heroin trade from Italy.
Yep. And she is driving like a dune buggy, and it goes, I mean, it's going up, Yesler Terrace. It's tearing downtown.
It goes downstairs, and upstairs she's gunning it. She's doing like 50 miles an hour down Alaskan Way.
It is so over the top. It is so kind of badly written, hilarious. It's just a hoot. And it has all these recognizable Seattle locations. She's chasing a bad guy on the roof of Ivers and shoots him, And then it's at another point, she's literally jumping off the Coleman dock. the ferry landing is jumping into Puget Sound. I mean, if you want a movie that really takes advantage of Seattle, McHugh and Scorchy are those films. You'll see more locations.
Well, and with Scorchy, I watched it, and what I loved about Scorchy is it showed sort of the very industrial, derelict docks, junk all over. I mean, it's really down there, right in the mud.
Right. Well, this is the waterfront before the sculpture park. This is the waterfront before the kind of viaduct came down. This is the old, the old waterfront, and you get glimpses of that in some of these early movies. And of course, if you were alive in Seattle in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, there's some nostalgia there for some of these locations that still exist, and of course for the ones that don't.
She didn't get any mud on her pantsuit and cape, and the hair was perfect.
Truly a superhero. Seattle also seemed to be a magnet for cinematic con artists. Harry in Your Pocket is a 1973 film shot in part in Union Station, Pioneer Square, and downtown that features a team of pickpockets. Another con movie is David Mamet's 1987 House of Games, in which a Seattle psychiatrist, played by Lindsay Krause, decides to study con men. A key meeting place is the now gone 211 Billiard Club on Union. The shrink is conned herself, but there's a deadly twist. And speaking of deadly, the campy thriller Black Widow, also from 1987, features Deborah Winger as a federal investigator who comes to town chasing a female serial killer played by Teresa Russell, who offs her husbands for money. This ushered in a darker era, which writer Tim Egan dubbed Northwest Noir. If Seattle could be a place of crime, then so too could its beautiful surroundings be infused with a sense of menace.
After the series of films that depicts Seattle as a set for crime and chase scenes and that stuff, then there seems to be kind of a darker turn. Writer Tim Egan calls it Northwest Noir.
Yeah, I think Tim wrote a piece in the New York Times, and it had to do with sort of dark, but also quirky. And David Lynch and the TV series Twin Peaks were sort of the personification of this. And it's interesting because, you have these sort of chase movies, you have these con men movies, and then suddenly you're not really in the heart of the city anymore. You're in that area that Alistair Cook talked about as being this sort of paradisical natural area surrounding the city. But instead of gazing at Mount Rainier, you're looking at the brooding hump of Mount Si in North Bend. And there's a crime involving, a possible serial killer, and maybe it's supernatural. And he made a film in 1992, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, which is a prequel to Twin Peaks that was partly filmed in Seattle. And it's just full of this kind of hallucinatory, weird, and you get the sense that the Northwest is full of demons and dream figures. And I describe it as a surrealistic hash. But this is a kind of interesting mood changer. It's not just a place where David Mamet is running, setting a con movie, but it's something about place. It's something about the place where Seattle is and the dark side of that. And of course,
right. Very dark and Freudian and.
Yes, but with a weird kind of whimsical element.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's part of, I think, the Northwest noir was. It's kind of noir, but there's maybe a bit of tongue-in-cheek to it as well.
And then we get to sort of almost a fluffy place, Seattle as the happy place, the peaceful place.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes, there's a period in Seattle's history kind of in the 80s and certainly in the 90s, where we become a sort of lifestyle town. And it's full of happy middle class people. And so this turn is interesting because you think about the movie to me that sort of symbolizes it is Harry and the Hendersons, which is a film about Bigfoot. Now, this is, one of the few Hollywood films that's actually about a Northwest, icon. It's about something that we claim as our own, this region's, mysterious creature. And of course, in this story, the father of this family, they're out camping and they're kind of a little bit hapless and chaotic, and they're driving the station wagon home and they hit Bigfoot. And this reminded me of something else my son said. We were talking about whether Bigfoot exists and what the evidence for that is not. And he said, I think the most telling thing about whether Bigfoot exists or not is that a roadkill Bigfoot has never been found. He said, if you drive around, you see a dead version of like just about every other animal. Why has Bigfoot not been hit by a car? Well, in this movie, he's run over by a station wagon. Anyway, the movie ends up with him becoming a beloved member of the family, and they're living in Seattle, and he escapes, and a big game hunter is after him, and the family is trying to save him and return him to the wild. And it's just one of those sort of Northwest movies that kids of a certain generation love that movie. It turned Bigfoot from this, scary, mysterious figure into this lovable
Sasquatch.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. And then, that movie is followed. You have Sleepless in Seattle.
Yes. The movie that everybody talked about. I mean, the buzz and the continuing legacy of that movie it's just unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, for one thing, Seattle's in the title. Right, and these other movies, Seattle is really just a secondary.
This is at the same time that Michael Kinsley, the founder or editor of Slate magazine, is featured on the cover of Newsweek with the title, "Everybody's Moving to Seattle, Should You?"
Yes, and he's holding a salmon, as I remember.
Right.
Yeah, but I think, this is in that sort of era of kind of the flowering of 90s yuppie Seattle. And I remember, Tom Hanks has this enormous houseboat in a prime location with a fabulous view. And I remember even at the time thinking, how could he afford that?
Even then,
let alone now. But there, a lot of movies, have touched base at the Pike Place Market. This movie has a scene where he and Rob Reiner's giving him dating advice, of all people, and they're sitting at the counter at the Athenian. I think they even have a plaque there. This is the Sleepless in Seattle seat at the counter.
It still has vibes. People still want to go to find that houseboat off Westlake. Still has a tourist legacy for sure.
Yeah, I didn't see it till I went on one of those duck tours. They don't do them anymore, but took my granddaughter, and we cruised right by the Sleepless in Seattle house.
Did somebody yell, "Get off my water"? So then we get to what you call the most definitive Seattle movie of the era.
Well, we're in the 90s, and the movie Singles comes out. Cameron Crowe wrote it. He used to live up in this part of the world. And, I described it as Friends Meet Grunge. I mean, it's a coming-of-age movie, a bunch of young 20-somethings living in Seattle. And, of course, they're living in these fabulous apartments on, barista income. So it's not current. I mean, the movie is dramatically dated. The thing is, in that movie, every cliche, Seattle cliche, coffee, mosh pits, flannel, grunge, one of the main characters is a high-speed transit advocate.
An urbanist.
Yeah, exactly. He gets turned down by the mayor, by the way, played by Tom Skerritt. Anyway, it's interesting in that you get this image of the grunge era in Seattle as having no darkness to it at all. And in fact, it's just a bunch of 20-somethings having the time of their life, and getting to go to great clubs every night. And it's funny because the movie, while it's like, sort of almost a caricature of Seattle or aspects of Seattle, it wasn't meant to be a Seattle movie. I read that Cameron Crowe, the film was actually in development in the 80s.
It wasn't meant to be a grunge movie?
Mm-mm. No, it was being written as a kind of teen romance, young people finding their way movie. And then when grunge hit, it was like, oh, we got to go to Seattle and turn it into a grunge movie. And it's interesting because it has grunge figures. Matt Dillon is one of the actors, and he has a band called Citizen Dick. Apparently they're not a very good band, but playing the band is the members of Pearl Jam. So you get to see, this kind of pre-fame cast.
In any other landmarks?
Well, there's a non-Seattle landmark, which is a standout. There's a 1999 film, 10 Things I Hate About You. And as I have come to understand, this movie, it's an important movie for a lot of young people, post-baby boomer folks. So you're talking millennials and Gen Z people. And it's a coming-of-age story. Heath Ledger is one of the stars, but he's, a high school student. And it takes place at a high school in Seattle. And some of it is filmed here. But the high school itself is the spectacular Stadium High School in Tacoma, which is, like how would you describe it? It's like a Victorian palace. Just has more character than any high school you've ever seen. And so they keep showing shots of that. And it's distracting, of course, if you're looking for Seattle locations, because you're like, that's not in Seattle. Nowadays, Seattle has been largely bypassed by Hollywood. Tinseltown has found a town that makes a better Seattle. Vancouver, BC is now a regular stand-in for the Emerald City. That's Hollywood.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. This episode was produced by Seth Halloran, and the executive producer is Mark Baumgarten. If you'd like to check out more videos from Mossback's Northwest, you can find them all at crosscut.com or kcts9.org. The video series is now in its 7th season. A new episode airs on Seattle's PBS station, KCTS9, every week through May. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. For more on all things Mossback, go to crosscut.com/Mossback. And if you'd like to support the work we do at Crosscut, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the live events we host every month, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of KCTS9. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly newsletter from Knute Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. Mossback is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.